You know, there are places in the world that don't seem to matter until they do. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. On a map, it's just a narrow ribbon of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But psychologically, it's a pressure point, like the space between your ribs that tightens when you're holding your breath. When that strait shuts down, the world holds its breath too. And in that breathless moment, you begin to understand just how thin the veneer of global stability really is. You see, choke points like the Strait of Hormuz are not just strategic maritime corridors. They're symbols of something much deeper. They remind us that our so-called global order is built on highly localized vulnerabilities. We talk about globalization as if it's a kind of magic. Goods flow, ships sail, economies grow. But that illusion crumbles fast when one nation decides to close a gate. Suddenly, all the high-level talk of interdependence turns into a scramble for leverage, oil futures spike, and nations start reaching for their playbooks. But here's the real story. It's not just about oil or trade. It's about psychology. It's about fear. Iran didn't need to fire a missile or launch a full-scale invasion to set the world on edge. All it had to do was shut a door. Why? Because in that act, Iran challenged something fundamental, the assumption that the system is too big to break. We live in a time where predictability is currency, stock markets thrive on it, politicians promise it, even ordinary people rely on it subconsciously to plan their lives. But when a geopolitical actor says no, there will be no passage today, it's like pulling a thread from the fabric of certainty. That thread may seem small, but when it's part of the seam that holds the whole thing together, the unraveling begins faster than most expect. The truth is, control over choke points represents something deeply psychological. It is the power to disrupt not just movement, but mental order. It's the power to insert anxiety into the bloodstream of global affairs. Think of it like this. When something so critical can be interrupted so easily, you begin to question what else might be standing on stilts. That's the kind of question that keeps generals awake at night, but it should also keep citizens thinking, because that same fragility applies to every system we trust. And that's where the philosophical layer comes in. We've built a civilization that is outwardly strong but inwardly fragile. One dependent not just on systems of logistics, but on the idea that those systems are invulnerable. And that's the illusion. What Iran did was more than close a waterway. It exposed a collective delusion that order is permanent, that dominance is eternal, that no one would dare upset the balance. But here we are, and the balance has been upset. So the next time you hear about a distant place like the Strait of Hormuz, don't brush it off as someone else's crisis. Understand it for what it really is, a mirror. It shows us the limits of our control, the volatility of our peace, and the urgency of rethinking what we truly depend on. Because sometimes it only takes one locked door to remind the world just how vulnerable the house really is. Oil is often talked about like it's just a resource, something you pump out of the ground, refine, and burn to keep things moving. But that's too simple. Oil is more than a commodity. It's the bloodstream of modern civilization. It fuels our economies, our militaries, our ambitions. But perhaps most importantly, it fuels our illusions of control. And when something threatens the flow of that fuel, as Iran just did by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, the world remembers how fragile it really is. You see, we've built a civilization that's become addicted to energy. Not in some vague, metaphorical sense, but in a deeply structural, mechanical, and psychological way. Our cities light up at night, our planes cut through the sky, and our supply chains stretch across oceans, not because of abstract innovation or global cooperation, but because oil keeps them alive. It's the hidden engine turning the gears, and yet, like many dependencies, we've grown comfortable, too comfortable, We assume the oil will always be there, that tankers will always pass through, that the system will always self-correct. Iran's move reminds us that that's not a law of nature. It's a bet, a risky one. What's interesting, what's deeply human, is how we respond when something vital becomes scarce. Panic isn't just an emotional reaction. It's a recognition of dependency, and dependency, when exposed, becomes fear. When prices rise and headlines scream, it's not just because oil is in short supply, it's because something deeper is happening. People begin to realize how little control they actually have over the systems they rely on. A nation flips a switch, and gas stations on the other side of the world feel the ripple. That's not just geopolitics. That's psychological vulnerability on a global scale. And here's the real tragedy. Most nations know this. They know they're dependent. But instead of addressing that dependency with resilience, they negotiate it away. They form uneasy alliances. They buy silence. They look the other way when authoritarian regimes commit violations, all in the name of stability. What they're really doing is mortgaging their values for the illusion of energy security. And that illusion is costly, not just in dollars but in principles. We tell ourselves we stand for freedom, for human rights, for sovereignty. But when push comes to shove, we often stand for cheap fuel. That contradiction eats away at the moral foundations of nations. Now, you can look at all this and feel powerless, or you can see it for what it really is, a wake-up call, because systems built on fragility will always be at the mercy of others. The only real insurance we have is diversification of energy, of alliances, of thought. And that starts with awareness. It starts with understanding that energy isn't just a matter of policy, it's a matter of philosophy. Do we want to live in a world where our comfort comes at the cost of our conscience? Or do we want to build something more stable, more just, and ultimately more human? What Iran did by shutting down the strait wasn't just a geopolitical move. It was a revelation. It showed us the strings behind the curtain, the levers behind the promises, the fear behind the power. It pulled us out of our assumptions and forced us to confront the raw, uncomfortable truth that we are only as strong as what we depend on. And if we're wise, we'll use this moment not to panic, but to rebuild, intelligently, ethically, and deliberately, because the future belongs not to those who control the oil, but to those who no longer need it. There's a contradiction at the heart of modern foreign policy, one that's hard to ignore when something like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz takes center stage. We live in a world where nations loudly declare their values, freedom, democracy, human rights, but quietly compromise those values when energy is at stake. It's not an accident. It's not even hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It's something deeper, something more troubling. It's a psychological trade-off, a moral transaction dressed up as strategy. And the world's silence in the face of that contradiction is often deafening. Think about it. When a country like Iran makes a bold move like shutting down one of the world's most critical oil corridors, the immediate reaction from Western powers isn't one of moral outrage. It's panic. Not because a rogue nation defied norms, but because that defiance threatens supply. That should tell us something. It tells us that, despite all the rhetoric, moral clarity comes second to material need, And that's a dangerous place to be, both politically and philosophically. We tend to believe that the institutions we've built, the alliances, the pacts, the economic systems, are grounded in shared ideals. And on paper, they are. But in practice, the equation changes when dependence enters the picture. When a nation needs oil to keep its economy running, to heat its homes, to keep factories moving, it becomes willing to overlook what it would otherwise condemn. And it does so under the banner of pragmatism. But pragmatism, when it routinely overrides principle, begins to hollow out the very ideals it claims to protect. This isn't just about foreign policy, it's about the human condition. We all do this on some level. We compromise to maintain comfort. We tolerate the intolerable, not because we believe it's right, but because it serves us. That's not inherently evil, it's human. But when that compromise becomes the rule rather than the exception, when it shapes the foundational behavior of nations, it becomes corrosive. It breeds cynicism. It makes it harder for people to believe in anything beyond immediate self-interest. And once that belief is lost, trust follows, and after trust, cohesion. The Strait of Hormuz, then, isn't just a battleground for power, it's a moral mirror. It reflects back to us the deals we've made silently over years and decades. It reminds us that we're not just struggling for control of energy routes. We're wrestling with the soul of our own priorities. Because every time a free nation turns a blind eye to authoritarian behavior in the name of strategic interest, it loses a piece of its own identity. An identity, once fractured enough times, becomes unrecognizable. This is where leadership matters, not just political leadership, but moral leadership, the kind that's willing to pay short-term costs for long-term integrity, the kind that doesn't flinch when values are tested, the kind that remembers that freedom isn't just something you protect with weapons, it's something you protect by refusing to sell it off when the pressure rises. We all have a part in this. We support systems every day through what we consume, what we tolerate, what we justify. And if we want those systems to change, if we want them to reflect the ideals we claim to believe in, we have to stop being passive participants in our own contradictions. Because in the end, every compromise made in silence becomes a precedent. And a world built on precedent, not principle, is a house without a foundation. And houses without foundations don't stand for long. You know, it's easy to label what Iran did as reckless, to call it defiant, disruptive, dangerous. And yes, on the surface, shutting down the Strait of Hormuz might look like a provocation, a reckless gamble against stronger powers. But if you slow down, if you step back and examine the deeper psychology behind it, you begin to see something else entirely. This wasn't just about oil or sanctions or military posturing. This was a deliberate act of will, a declaration, not just to the world but to themselves, that they will no longer be moved like pawns on someone else's board. Because sometimes power isn't about strength in the traditional sense. Sometimes it's not about tanks or missiles or numbers. Sometimes power is about disrupting the rhythm everyone else has come to rely on. And when a nation says, "We're not playing by your rules anymore," it's stepping into dangerous territory, yes, but also into a place of agency. Iran's action is, at its core, a reassertion of sovereignty. It's a reminder that even when cornered, a player can still flip the table. Now, I'm not here to justify their decision, but we must try to understand it. Because understanding doesn't mean agreement, it means clarity, and what we're witnessing isn't just political behavior. It's philosophical, it's existential. This is about a country reclaiming narrative in a world where narratives are usually written by the powerful. Iran, like many nations outside the Western sphere, has spent decades watching as others defined its role, drew its borders, judged its choices, and eventually a line gets crossed, not on a map, but in the mind. A nation says enough. This is where Nietzsche's idea of the will to power becomes relevant, not as a quest for domination, but as a psychological necessity. The will to power is the need to assert oneself in a world that seeks to define you. It's a force not driven purely by ambition, but by the unbearable tension of being voiceless. And when that tension reaches a breaking point, you don't just push back, you act symbolically. Closing the strait wasn't just an act of obstruction. It was a message, loud and clear. We choose disruption over obedience. We choose uncertainty over silence. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Disruption, even when dangerous, often commands more respect than quiet submission. The international community scrambles not because Iran fired shots, but because Iran stopped asking for permission. That shift in posture rattles the core assumptions of global power. It tells other nations watching from the margins, you don't have to play by their rules to make them listen. But there's a cost, always. Defiance doesn't come free. When you assert your will in a world built on interdependence, the backlash is inevitable. Sanctions, isolation, retaliation. But for Iran, the move was worth the price. Because they weren't just challenging a blockade. They were challenging invisibility. And sometimes being seen, even as a threat, is more empowering than being ignored as irrelevant. This, then, is a moment not just for geopolitics, but for reflection. Because the deeper message reaches all of us. Whether you're a nation or an individual, there comes a time when you must ask yourself a difficult question. Are you living by conviction or by compliance? Are you shaping your own story, or simply surviving inside someone else's? Iran's action forces the world to reckon with that question. And whether we agree with their method or not, we can't ignore the courage it takes to say, we will no longer be defined by your expectations. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something greater. Not just for nations, but for each of us. Because in a world addicted to obedience, one act of authentic defiance can echo far louder than any consensus ever could. When the Strait of Hormuz was shut, the world didn't just react. It flinched, like a reflex. Governments convened emergency meetings, markets spiraled, media channels burst into round-the-clock coverage. You'd think someone had fired a shot heard round the world, but no bombs dropped. No cities burned. What happened was far more revealing than that. What happened was a loss of narrative control. And in today's world, that might be the most dangerous kind of loss. See, the great powers of the world have become skilled at telling a story. A story of order, of control, of systems that work because they're too big to fail. That story is repeated in press conferences, diplomatic summits, and economic forecasts. It's a kind of psychological architecture built to reassure billions of people that someone, somewhere, has their hands on the wheel. But when Iran took a simple, bold action, closing one waterway, that entire structure trembled. And not because the move was militarily overwhelming, but because it broke the script. Panic, at its root, is not just fear. Panic is what happens when our expectations collapse. It's a psychological freefall. The great nations of the world expected Iran to remain within the limits of deterrence, to stay within predictable bounds. When that didn't happen, the illusion shattered. And that's the key word, illusion. Because the idea that global powers are always in control is a narrative we want to believe. But belief isn't fact. And when belief collides with reality, we often choose to react with force or denial rather than reflection. But maybe reflection is what we need most right now. Let's be honest. Much of the global order has been running on momentum rather than mastery. Systems held together not by resilience, but by repetition. By the hope that yesterday's tools will work on tomorrow's problems. Iran's defiance, however you judge it, revealed how quickly those tools become blunt when the game changes. When a single disruption throws multiple governments into reactive mode, it shows how deeply dependent we've become on routines, on choreography that leaves little room for surprise. And here's where it gets truly philosophical. If you build your strength on predictability, then unpredictability becomes your greatest weakness. The world isn't unraveling because Iran is powerful enough to defeat the West. It's trembling because the West, and much of the world with it, has become uncomfortable with uncertainty. We've designed our institutions to manage outcomes, not disruptions. And disruption is precisely what the 21st century keeps throwing our way. That discomfort reveals a deeper truth. Control has always been, in part, a story we tell ourselves to feel safe. But real power doesn't come from controlling every variable. It comes from knowing what to do when control slips away. Iran understands that. They may not have the most firepower, but they understand leverage. They understand timing, and most dangerously of all, they understand how to make the world listen, not by speaking louder, but by breaking silence in a moment of global complacency. And that's something we all need to think about. Because this isn't just a lesson for diplomats or generals. It's a lesson for all of us. We build our lives the same way nations build foreign policy. Round expectations, routines, the comfort of thinking tomorrow will look like today. But when the unexpected hits, and it always does, what matters is not whether you had a plan, but whether you had the strength to respond without fear. So as the world regathers itself in the aftermath of this disruption, we're left with a choice. Do we patch up the illusion and hope for more stable days? Or do we confront the truth that stability is not given? It's earned, moment, by those willing to face chaos with clarity. Because the world didn't panic because it was weak. It panicked because it forgot how to be uncertain, and remembering that learning to stand firm when the ground shifts might just be the first step toward real strength. Crisis has a way of revealing what was always there, lurking beneath the surface. It strips away the polished language, the carefully constructed systems, the comforting narratives, and shows us the raw truth, that much of what we take for granted is built on assumptions. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz wasn't just a geopolitical tremor, it was a psychological one. It jolted the world awake, not just to the fragility of our energy systems or the volatility of our alliances, but to something more personal. It reminded us that the global stage and our individual lives are not so different. Both can be upended by a single, unexpected disruption. We live in a world that prizes comfort and predictability. We build careers, relationships, economies, even identities, on the idea that things will remain stable if we follow the rules. But crisis doesn't play by those rules. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for convenience. It just arrives, and when it does, it doesn't just challenge nations. It challenges people. It forces each of us to confront a question we often avoid. What am I standing on? And is it real? That's the heart of it. In moments like this, when the world shifts, we're forced to realize that resilience isn't something you can borrow from your government, your community, or even your culture. Real resilience, true stability, comes from within. It's built in the quiet moments, in the disciplines no one sees, in the clarity you've forged long before the storm hits. And when everything around you begins to tremble, that's when it shows up, not as panic, but as presence, not as fear, but as focus. Now, I understand it's tempting to look at a crisis like this one and think, that's for leaders to handle, that's a government problem, that's out of my hands. But let's not forget, systems are just people, scaled up. And the strength of any system, like the strength of any person, depends on how it responds under pressure. If we want stronger nations, we need stronger individuals. If we want clarity on the world stage, we need clarity in our own minds. It starts there, because here's the truth: resilience isn't just about bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward. It's about using disruption as a catalyst, not just for survival, but for transformation. Iran's bold move reminded the world that control is an illusion, but it also offered a deeper lesson that clarity is more powerful than control. And clarity begins with asking the hard questions. Who are we when the lights go out? What do we really believe when comfort is stripped away? And what kind of world do we want to rebuild when the dust settles? These are not abstract ideas. They are the foundations of character. Yours, mine, and ours. And just like the Strait of Hormuz can choke the flow of oil, fear can choke the flow of action, but it doesn't have to, because fear, when acknowledged and faced head-on, becomes fuel. It becomes the fire that forges integrity, courage, and direction. So yes, this is a moment of crisis, but more than that, it's a moment of choice. Not just for the policymakers and the generals, but for the thinkers, the doers, the ordinary people quietly building their lives in uncertain times. Because the future will not be shaped by those who avoid disruption. It will be shaped by those who grow through it. And the ones who grow are the ones who have learned this truth. When the world feels out of control, your greatest power lies in the one thing no one else can take from you: your clarity, your courage, and your will to act.